Today's lecture is a very simple one, What's New at Machu Picchu. You've seen all that before. There is one little bit more of the title here, The Assistance of Mariana Mold de Pis. As we run through the lecture, you will see why I'm crediting her for part of this lecture. Very important part of the lecture comes through the assistance of Mariana Mold de Pis. She was the assistant director of a program I ran a couple different times in Lima in the 1980s. Start out with a time chart. The Incas were the last of a series of cultures in Peru. They spread all across the Andes. Their empire stretched from the modern Colombia-Ecuador border in the north down to central Chile, actually south of Santiago in the far south. They followed on a number of different cultures. My own doctoral dissertation was on one of the cultures that was before them in the North Coast region, the Chimu. I've also studied a lot the Moche culture in the North Coast, but the Incas were kind of latecomers. They developed around 1200 or 1250 AD, and they really began to expand in the late 1300s, and really their empire was only about 100, 150 years old at the time of the Spanish conquest in 1532. Also, I might point out, somebody has criticized me, I've made 2 or 3 spelling errors on some of the PowerPoints. I am not misspelling Inca. I know how to spell it. The preferred spelling in Peru by the Peruvians is the Inka. It more closely represents how the word is spelled and pronounced in the Quechua language. So among scholars, that's the way you'll usually see it in at least scholarly professional text. The Incas had their capital in Cusco, Peru, which is right there, south-central highlands of Peru. It's about an hour and 10-minute flight from Lima. Most people go there from Lima and fly into the airport at Cusco. In this map, Cusco is there at the bottom left, and Machu Picchu is at the far upper right. It's only about 70, 75 miles as the crow flies, but unfortunately you cannot get there as the crow flies these days. You used to be able to. I have flown 3 times in a helicopter from Cusco to Machu Picchu, but they no longer provide that service or allow that service. Here, Cusco is at the bottom, and Machu Picchu there is in the top. This view is looking to the north, and it's a Google Earth image. It's kind of at an angle. So out there at the upper top right is out in the Amazon and the Andes Mountains there, mainly on the left-hand side of the picture. Machu Picchu is actually lower than Cusco. A lot of people think it's up on the top of a mountain. Cusco's at almost 11,000 feet, but the archaeological site is only at about 7,000 feet. And the town that most people stay at, if you're staying overnight, is down around 6,000 feet. The river that runs around the site is called the Urubamba, one of the major tributaries of the Amazon, and the site is on a ridge between 2 peaks. We'll see those peaks in a number of these pictures coming up. The town is called Aguascalientes. If you go by train, you get off at Aguascalientes and take a bus up to the site, and then the site itself is on this ridge between two peaks. Now, I'm going to start out just kind of talking for a bit. We're going to see this picture for a couple of minutes. I want to talk about this guy, Hiram Bingham. He's an interesting character. Hiram Bingham was born in 1875 in Hawaii. His parents and grandparents were missionaries. In fact, his grandparents were very, very successful as among the very first missionaries to Hawaii. His parents, unfortunately, were not successful missionaries. They had gone out to some small island in the Pacific and had failed. After a couple of years, they had converted only 2 or 3 people, and they had retreated back when his mother was pregnant with him. They had retreated back to Honolulu, and for the rest of the time he was in Hawaii, his parents were living under the shadow of his grandparents. As a young man, young boy, he wanted to get out of Hawaii. Finally, at the age of 14, he went to a boarding school in Connecticut, I think, and then he went to Yale University. At Yale, he was one of the poorest students when most of the students in the late 1800s were very rich. He had to work his way through school. Then after he graduated, he was going to become a missionary, but on the way out back to Hawaii, he stopped in California and he decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Berkeley. That's what he did. He wrote his master's thesis on the history of the missions in Hawaii. Recent research has demonstrated that clearly it was a plagiarized master's thesis. But from that, he went to Harvard for a doctorate in history. And I always told my students that when you want to be successful in life, there are many, many different ways you can do it. You can work real hard, or you can win the lottery or something. He kind of won the lottery. He married the heiress to the Tiffany fortune. If you want to get ahead in life, that is one of the ways you can do it. This is him with his fiancée, Alfreda, when they were at Harvard. There he is with his wife there in the bottom right with his in-laws. Ultimately, they had, I think, 5 or 6 kids, all boys. And this is the house, a small cottage that his parents, or his in-laws, built for them. It is supposedly the 3rd largest house that's ever been built in New Haven, Connecticut. It is now part of a small college in New Haven. During the First World War, he was a officer, colonel. He went to France. This is him again, or there in France. He was the commander of a training base. He wasn't in combat, but he was commanding a base that was training pilots. He became a pilot himself. And then he got into politics. He got elected as lieutenant governor of Connecticut, and then he ran for a term as governor. When he was elected as governor, but before he was inaugurated, one of the senators from Connecticut died. Now, the governor would normally appoint somebody to fill out a term like that. And what happened here is that the governor at the time the guy died did not appoint anybody. He waited until Hiram was inaugurated as senator. And the day after Hiram was inaugurated, he resigned as governor. And the lieutenant governor became governor and immediately appointed him as the senator. So he did run and become the senator. He ultimately got a full 6-year term again in the Senate. There he is on the left. He actually flew this thing onto the steps of the Capitol. He was referred to as the flying senator, and he actually did some stuff in terms of creating the airmail service in the United States, things like that. There he is on the right, as senator, on the left when he was at Machu Picchu. He had several expeditions to Machu Picchu. The one that's so famous is the one from 1911, July 1911, when he discovered Machu Picchu. And based on his World War I service in the military and also his fame as governor and senator and so forth, he is now buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Those of you who can read it, you might notice that he's buried with his wife, his second wife. The Alfreda Mitchell, the heiress, ran off with her piano teacher. He wrote a number of books about his discoveries. The story that gets him to Peru and to Machu Picchu, when Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas in November of 1532. They captured the Inca king, a guy by the name of Atahualpa. They held him prisoner for about 11 months, and they required him to have his people bring in gold and silver as treasure. He was supposed to fill a room all the way up with gold once and with silver twice. And when that treasure was brought in, they killed Atahualpa. They strangled him. They appointed another guy as the new king, kind of a puppet, a man by the name of Manco. And Manco, after a couple years, decided he had had enough of these Spanish guys and staged revolt. They almost got rid of the Spanish. It was not quite successful. A reinforcements reached Cusco to break a siege just kind of at the last minute. Manco, after the rebellion failed, fled into the forests, into the jungles to the north of Cusco in the direction of Machu Picchu. And actually the Incas had a puppet, or not a puppet, a separate state, an Inca kingdom, for about 40 years. It wasn't until the 1570s that the Spanish ultimately conquered or captured the last of the Inca rebellious leaders. And so there was always this stories of this lost Inca place out in the jungles to the north of Cusco someplace that many people had tried to find, but at the time of Hiram Bingham, nobody had really identified. We now know where it is, but he wrote these 3 books. This is the one that's still in press, written in 1948. It was his last book. You can still find this. It is still in print. This is a quote from one of his books, and I've highlighted the important things in red there. Hiram Bingham always argued that no one had ever been to Machu Picchu from the time of the Incas up to him in July of 1911, that nobody around there knew anything about it. He was the discoverer of Machu Picchu. And that's his claim to fame. Now, this woman that was my associate director, assistant director back in the 80s in Lima, Mariana Mold de Piz, wrote a book called Machu Picchu and the Code of Ethics of the Society of American Archaeology. What she was trying to do with this book, the material that Hiram Bingham excavated was taken to Yale University with the promise that it would be returned after having been studied. And at the time of this book, there's Mariana and her husband. At the time that she wrote this book, the material had not been returned, and she wanted to get it back to Peru. That stuff, the material that had been excavated, she wanted to get it back to Peru in honor of her husband. Her husband there, Franklin, was one of my best friends in Peru. Unfortunately, he died of pancreatic cancer in 1999. And she wrote this book in his honor to get the stuff back. It was her mission in life to honor her husband. There's Mariana and I a little bit later. It has that title. The Code of Ethics of the Society of American Archaeology is that when you excavate something, you will get the stuff back to the people, or you'll put it back in the ground. You won't just hold on to it forever. And here, Yale University had the stuff for over 90 years and not returned it. This is a map that comes from that book, and the map was made, it has the title there, The Map of the Valleys of Parcartambo, Lares, Ocobamba, and the Quebrada Vilcanota, which is the area around Machu Picchu. It was done by Hermann Göring. This is not the World War II general Hermann Göring. This is a guy that was working in Peru earlier. The date on the map is 1874, and again, I find this map in her book. Here's a close-up on that map. And can you see the name Machu Picchu? Hiram Bingham said nobody knew about this place. There it is on a 1874 map. Nobody knew about it. If some of you, if you've been to Machu Picchu, you may have gone through the town of Ollantaytambo and simply you went down this valley, river valley, Urubamba, down to the site. Here's another map. This one was done by a French geographer. It was published in 1880. The work for the map was done in the 1860s, so even before Hermann Göring's map. And there's a close-up on it. Can you see the name Machu Picchu? It's spelled a little differently, but there's Machu Picchu. There's also a name Huayna Picchu and Intihuatana. We'll see those names at the site a little bit later. Nobody knew about the place. Here's a map. Not a map, a land sale document dated 1781. And this is somebody selling a bunch of property in Peru to somebody else. Can you see the name Machu Picchu there? Somebody sold the place in 1781. Hiram Bingham said nobody knew about the place. This is a letter that Hiram Bingham sent to a man in Cusco. The date on it is May 12th, 1913. So it's after the quote-unquote discovery in 1911. There's the upper part of it. It's written to a man, an interesting guy by the name of Alberto Gasecki. Gasecki was an American. He got a PhD in economics from Penn State, or excuse me, the University of Pennsylvania. The president of Peru at that time, in the late 1800s, asked for somebody to come down to the United States to help modernize the educational system. And the president of the University of Pennsylvania had this young guy that had just gotten his PhD, sent Gasecki down, and he spent most of the rest of his life in Peru. He actually married a woman from Cusco. He was mayor of Cusco 2 different times, and he was the head of the local university in Cusco for many years. So sending this letter, and down at the bottom there's a P.S. He says in his P.S., this is 1913, he says that the April issue of 1913 is going to have a story about Machu Picchu. In point of fact, the entire issue of National Geographic, April 1913, is about Machu Picchu and Hiram Bingham's discoveries. It was the first time that National Geographic ever devoted an entire issue to one site, one place. And the last sentence there is an interesting one. He says, I shall be glad to know how our friends in Cusco like it, how like that article. And then underlined there will, I fear, be some things in it which will not please them. When those people in Cusco read that Machu Picchu was discovered by Hiram Bingham, they're not going to be real happy. Because, in fact, people had been there. There was actually graffiti at the site when he arrived there in 1911. You know, people had been there. People knew about it. They probably even told him where it was. Because the day he discovered it, he left everybody else in his expedition down by the river. He had one soldier with him, guarding him, and they climbed up to the site, and lo and behold, they found what he probably knew was already there. So let's go to Machu Picchu. I'm going to show you these pictures fairly quickly. Every time you go, it's different. This view is taken from a spot called the Sun Gate. It's the last spot on the Inca Trail before you get to the site. You look down, there's the site. In the background there is the peak of Huayna Picchu. This view is taken from the top of Machu Picchu mountain. There are 2 mountains overlooking the site. This is from the higher one. We're looking down. The site is on a ridge between these 2 peaks. Or there's a little bit closer view. There's the view from Huayna Picchu. And those last 2 photos were taken from up there. I was talking to somebody on this ship several days ago, probably about a week ago, and they said they had climbed to the top of Machu Picchu mountain. They are the first people I have ever run into that have climbed to the top of Machu Picchu mountain. It is a hellacious climb. This is also from Huayna Picchu looking down. But every time you go, it's different. The weather is different. The sunlight is different. It's just a magical spot. If you look to the west, off in the far distance, there are snow-capped peaks. From the top of Machu Picchu mountain, in every direction, you'll see snow-capped peaks. There's a little bit closer view. Every time you go, it looks different. I've only been about 40 times. I've done about 40 tours to Peru, and every tour we always did Machu Picchu. One of the things you might notice is the terraces. Clearly, agriculture has something to do with the site. We now believe that the resident population was probably no more than about 200 or 250, and it's been calculated out by, there's a couple in Denver, Colorado. They run a company called Wright Hydraulic Engineers, and they have studied the site. They've studied several other Inca sites in Peru for hydrology and agriculture. They point out that the terraces there are not even able to support a population of a couple hundred people. Most of the food must have been being brought in. But lots of terraces. Some of the terraces are higher than they are wide, like those there. And if you're there in the rainy season and you slip, it's only about 1,000 feet down to the Urubamba River. They do lose a few people every year falling off the terraces. Now, I'm only going to show you 2 different buildings at the site. And the first one I want to talk about is usually called the Sun Temple. And it's located right there. The Incas did many, many different things that were fantastic. Their stonework is particularly impressive, and of their stonework, there's a style that we usually refer to as Inca Imperial style or Cusco style. Is the very, very best stonework. Most of the buildings at this site are not in that imperial style. They're cruder style. All these buildings you see here on the left in the foreground. But high status buildings like this temple are in the very, very best Inca style. Again, the Sun Temple is there just dead center. It's the one that has this curving wall to it. You can always spot that curving wall. There's a little bit closer view. It's built around a rock, and the Incas loved to carve rocks. They modified nature, things like the terraces, by diverting rivers, by channeling rivers. They loved to modify nature, and here there's a rock that this thing is built around. Notice also the window. There are actually two different windows. One points to the southeast, one to the northeast. This is the window there that points to the southeast. Notice the bedrock down at the bottom, and then this beautiful, beautiful Cusco imperial-style masonry. Every block fitted together so tightly that you could not really get a knife blade between the adjacent rocks. On this photo, we see the two windows. The one on the left points to the southeast. The one on the right points to the northeast. Now, imagine that somehow you could identify the center point of that window. My friend Richard Berger from Yale University has said that maybe they put a window frame in there and had a plumb bob that came down from the top center. This is the window that points to the northeast. The one there on the right points to the southeast. This is inside. And notice on this one, first of all, in the old days, you used to be able to get in here. If you've been there recently, you didn't even get close to this. But in the old days, you used to be able to be inside. And the date, put in even the day there, June 13th, this is about a week or so ahead of the winter solstice. In the southern hemisphere, the winter solstice would be June 20th or 21st. Notice the shadow or the sunlight coming through that window that points to the northeast at the time of near the winter solstice. This is my photo from that same day out the window, and it's not quite where the sun would be on the winter solstice. I found this one on the web, and supposedly this is from the winter solstice date. But again, imagine you could somehow identify the center point of that window, maybe with even strings from those four projecting stones. So somehow you identify where the center point of that window is. And if you could do that, where would the center point of that window shadow fall inside? So let's spot where the center point is. And where would the shadow of a center point, if you had a plumb bob hanging down, or if you had these strings there, where would the center point show as a shadow? It would be right along where they've carved the rock. This is, in other words, an astronomical observatory. It helps you to identify when the winter solstice is. The rock is also carved. You can't really see it well, but this would be the line right there, where the winter solstice line would be. The rock is also carved, so there's a window on the right-hand side there that points to the southeast, and there is a place there where you could do the same thing at the summer solstice. So it is an astronomical observatory. There's our line where the winter solstice would be, and around the corner of this rock would be where the line for the summer solstice would be. The Incas loved things like caves, entrances to the underworld. And right underneath the Sun Temple, there is a cave. Again, it's kind of unfortunate today you cannot get into this. You used to be able to go inside. Now they have a rope and you're not allowed to get real close. When you used to be able to go into it, you could see that some beautiful stonework is inside, along with large trapezoidal niches. The guess here is that at the time the Incas were occupying this site, they would place mummy bundles, individuals that were mummified, wrapped with cloth, and that would be stored in those large trapezoidal niches there inside that cave. There are actually lots of caves. Hiram Bingham excavated many, many of them. You can see the trapezoidal niches there. And this is another example of caves. There's caves all up and down the hillsides here. I don't remember the exact total, but something like 30, 40 caves were excavated by Hiram Bingham. He did find over 150 skeletal remains at the site, none of real high status. The Incas loved to modify nature. They loved to have flowing water. They loved things like fountains and baths. This, again, beautiful Cusco-style, imperial-style masonry where you can hardly get a knife blade between the rocks, each rock carved to fit the ones next to it. And this is a nice example of one of the fountains. There's a series of, I think, 14 or 15 of these fountains that are flowing down the hillside. There's a spring up on the hill, water comes in, and then goes down a series of these fountains or baths. This is looking straight down into one. Again, you can see how wonderfully it has been carved. There's another building that I want to talk about, and it is a building that we find at many Inca sites, although relatively few look like this one. It's a building called the Intihuatana, which is usually translated as the hitching post to the sun. It was part of their ritual around the sun. And it's located on a little peak or little pile of stone, natural stone, there in the middle of the site. It's right there. And here it's this little shaft of stone. Now, one of the things that caused Hiram Bingham to think that this was the lost city of the Incas, that the Spanish never found it, didn't even know about it, was that it had an Intihuatana. At almost all the other Inca sites where there was something like this, they were destroyed by the Spanish in the 1500s or very early 1600s. The Spanish had a series of what were called the campaigns to extirpate idolatry, to eliminate the native religion. In any place they found something like this, they destroyed them. This one was not damaged, so Hiram Bingham said, oh, the Spanish must have never been here. There's the Intihuatana. So the fact that it was not destroyed, was not damaged in any way, shape, or form, was one of the bits of evidence that Hiram Bingham was using. I like this picture. This is from May 1982. Whenever you're at the site, if it's foggy, the clouds are coming in, you get this eerie, misty feeling. This particular picture, that's not the case. Used to be that they would let the grass grow on the terraces during the rainy season, from about November to March or April. And along about May, they used to cut the grass and pile it up. And when the guards at the site want to kick people out, along about 5 o'clock, they'll blow whistles and they move everybody out of the site and clear the site. And on this particular day, I was sitting on a terrace up above the site, near the top of the site, with right below me on a terrace was the Japanese film crew. They were going to film sunset at Machu Picchu. And what happened was that as the guards walked through the site to clear people out, they were also lighting on fire these piles of grass that had been cut. That is not eerie mist, that's smoke from this burning grass. I don't know a word of Japanese, but I know what these Japanese guys were saying. They were just throwing up their hands, and their sunset picture was absolutely ruined by that. But there's our Intihuatana. There's a little bit closer view. This is from 1999. But the thing was that it was never damaged, never destroyed or anything by the Spanish. My wife and I were there in September of 2000, early September of 2000, and we were at the site and we were kind of walking around, and we got to the Intihuatana, and I said, there's a chip on it. And I said to the guard, there's always used to be a guard that sat up here. I said, that chip is new. He said, oh no, that's always been there. It's been there forever. I said, no, I've been at the site many, many times. That chip is new. Oh no. This is a photo that I've taken from Mariana Pisa's book. And what happened was that there was a film crew filming around the Intihuatana. They were actually filming a beer commercial for a Peruvian brewery, and it was a Peruvian film crew, happily. It was not foreigners. It would have been an international incident. But they had this crane that they were going to have swing around the entire Intihuatana, get a 360 view of it. And the crane collapsed on the Intihuatana. And so there was the chip. And it used to be very obvious. Not so obvious today. This is from a couple years ago. So after 15, 16 years, it had weathered, so it really wasn't obvious. But you don't even see this today, because today they no longer let you walk around the Intihuatana. You have to walk in front of it, and you don't get to see the chip. Which leads me to the biggest problem at Machu Picchu these days, which is people. I've been going to Machu Picchu since 1972, and I've tried to find some statistics here. These are statistics from what used to be called the Instituto Nacional de Cultura. Now it's the Ministry of Culture. But back in the 80s, the earliest statistics I've found is that in the 80s there were perhaps 30,000 people visiting the site, less than 100 per day. By the early 90s, it had doubled up in the 70s. And I'll just run through these very quickly. You'll see what is happening. UNESCO, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recommends that there be no more than 2,500 visitors to the site per day. So these days, that's all they do, is they sell 2,500 tickets. But you can also buy a ticket to climb Huayna Picchu Mountain. They sell 500 of those, which don't count for the 2,500, even though you have to go through the site to get to Huayna Picchu. And if they sell out of those, they will sell up to 500 to climb Machu Picchu Mountain, which nobody really does. It's a hellacious climb. It's an all-day climb. But if they have to, they could sell those. Since 2008, you can't find statistics on how many people go there. Although a couple of years ago, they did say that about 1.5 million people visited the site. If you do some quick mental calculations, you will see that 1.5 million people is well more than 2,500 per day. So the real problem is the crowds. The latest thing that's just happened in the last year or so is that they now sell morning tickets and afternoon tickets, so that you divide up when people are arriving, but it's just really the crowds. The place is pretty much overwhelmed. It's busiest between about June and September. It is open all year round, although again in the rainy season from November to March, it can rain very heavily. But lots and lots of people all over the site. This is right by the Intihuatana, and it's 2006. You still at that point could walk around it. Again, no longer can you do that, and they kind of move you along. Today there are 3 routes through the site, and you have to stay with your guide on the route. You can no longer go into the site by yourself. You have to have a guide, and you have to stay on one of the designated routes. How do you get there? Some people hike in. Frankly, I have never done the hike. The thing that we've done many times, something like 8 or 10 times, you used to be able to go backwards on the trail. So we would go to the last spot, the last night's camp spot, Huayna. We could do that in the morning and come back in the afternoon. So we've done the last little bit of the trail. And you could also today use the trail to get up a place called the Sun Gate. Most of the people who do the hike have guides and have porters that carry all their stuff. All you have to have is a little day pack. This is actually on the trail up to the Sun Gate, or coming down from the Sun Gate. Most people these days go by train, and there are several different trains. This is the fanciest one. It's called the Hiram Bingham, very exclusive train. There are lots of these trains. They're literally running from Ollantaytambo or even near Cusco on a literally hourly basis. There are trains coming in all the time. And when you get off the train, you're in a town called Aguascalientes. You fight your way through the vendors, just like we were in Cartagena, and you get yourself to the bus station, and you get a ticket, and you go up to the site. If you are on a guided tour, obviously they would have the bus tickets ready for you, and you get on a little bus, and you go up that road. The road was opened in 1948. Prior to that, the only way up was on the back of mules or walking. So here's our bus ride. From Aguascalientes, we cross a bridge over the Urubamba River and start up the road. It's a narrow one-way or one-lane road. It takes about 20 minutes to get from down by Aguascalientes up to the site. And again, it's a one-way road, but buses are coming both ways. So when you meet a bus coming the other way, it's a lot of fun. If you're interested in going to Machu Picchu, I promised Bruce that I would tell you. The Mariner has, in October of next year, 2020, it has a voyage from Los Angeles to Lima. You could get off in Lima and go to Machu Picchu, or you could get on in Lima after having gone to Machu Picchu in November of 2020, Lima to Buenos Aires. It has in June of 2021 a Miami-Lima one, and then it follows Lima to Auckland, New Zealand. The Voyager has one in January of 2021, Buenos Aires to Lima, and then back from Lima to Buenos Aires in February 2021. The Navigator has one, actually the one that's coming up the fastest is Navigator April 2020, Papeete to Lima, and then Lima to Miami in April of 2020. So there are at least 3 of the ships and about something like 8 or 9 different voyages that would get you either starting or ending in Lima, which would allow you to get there. Title of my lecture was What's New at Machu Picchu? And I'll start out with this video that I took off of television from about 3 or 4 years ago. Hopefully.
Archaeologists discovered some ancient artifacts last week in Machu Picchu, the world-renowned Inca city in southeast Peru. The pieces were found buried below a 3-walled patio known as Wairana in Quechua. The discoveries include clay jugs, a ceremonial pot, 10 malachite beads, bronze clasp, and carved stones.
This was an offering that was imported, perhaps by the Chimus themselves or by the Incas. We didn't find anything else apart from these objects.
No encontramos otra evidencia aparte de esos objetos.
The Chimu lived on the northern coast of Peru and were later conquered by the Incas around 1470 AD.
Los Incas, como se sabe, ¿no? Ellos han llegado por...
The Incas, as we know, expanded to the north of the American continent, to the south, to the jungle, and also to the sea. They had a policy of both integration and expansion, and managed in some way or another to conquer other peoples, whether it was done peacefully or in many cases with violence.
A estas culturas nos han sometido de una forma pacífica o en muchos casos violenta.
Machu Picchu was rediscovered in 1911 by American explorer Hiram Bingham. It had been unknown to the outside world for over 3 centuries, but is now one of the most famous sites in Peru.
The material that was found there was from a culture on the north coast called the Chimu. That's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation, was a Chimu material. We believe that the Chimu, when they were conquered by the Incas around 1460, 1470, some of their best craftspeople, particularly gold workers, metal workers, would have been taken from the north coast to Cusco, and perhaps some got here to Machu Picchu. Looking at a variety of bits of evidence, one of the things that archaeologists really love these days is to find teeth. 2 different things about teeth, or 3 different things. One is that just the shape of teeth tells you some things where people came from. The different cultures, Caucasian, Negro, and Asian, have different tooth forms. So that can give you a little bit of interesting evidence. But also, when your adult teeth form, the minerals in the water that you are drinking at that time are locked into those teeth. And what you can do is look at the minerals in the tooth, and you compare it to the local minerals in the water. You do this by analyzing animal teeth that are living right there, gophers or whatever, and you can tell whether those are local teeth or that they have been brought in from someplace else. And what they've done from that is that they've seen that many of the people at Machu Picchu were not living locally at the time that their adult teeth were formed. The other thing that comes out of teeth studies is that when you have a dental plaque, when you go to the dentist and they remove your plaque, the plaque actually will contain some evidence of what you were eating on a daily basis. And so people these days are real excited if they can find some ancient dental plaque. In Peru, skulls were deformed, as with babies, by strapping babies to cradles or backboards. And the north coast, they tended to flatten the back of the skull. We now know that about a third of the skulls recovered at Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham seem to be north coast style skulls as compared to other parts of Peru. And clearly we have evidence from historical documents, early Spanish, particularly from the north coast, that talk about people being taken from Chimu area, north coast Peru, off to the Inca heartland. There is some research going on now about DNA. There's people at Yale, at George Washington University, I think, and UC Santa Cruz. A couple people at UC Santa Cruz are looking at DNA. Every time I start to give this lecture, I go online and looking for final results. I have not seen any results of the DNA studies. The betting is that they will come out as DNA from at least the North Coast for a bunch of the people. But one of these days, we're going to get those results. Now, the other question that a lot of people ask is, what was Machu Picchu? And I'm going to give you my interpretation. First of all, when you look at it, it's got a lot of terraces. So something was going on with agriculture. We know that the Inca, the top guy, participated in a series of rituals involved with agriculture. This is a little woodcut drawing taken from a book or a letter that a man by the name of Felipe Huaman Poma de Ayala wrote in the early 1600s. He sent this letter to the Spanish king. We don't know whether the Spanish king ever got it, but we know that the letter was ultimately found in the early 1900s, about 1910, in an archive in Denmark somehow. How it got there, who knows. It is frequently published. It's not the kind of letter most of us would be writing. It's 3 volumes when it's published. So it is a huge, long letter. It contains a very large number of these little woodcut drawings. In this woodcut drawing, the Inca, the highest status guy, we know that by his headdress there, is talking to a llama. He's actually saying yi to the llama. He's about to sacrifice the llama, and he's participating in a ritual here. Many archaeological sites in the Cusco area have these terraces. This is the Pisac site. This is one called Morai. I took this picture out the window of a helicopter on the way to Machu Picchu one time. There's a little closer view. It's got these very, very interesting circular terraces. Still today, there are people that are involved with agricultural rituals. I took this picture one time in a valley south of Cusco, and these people were in their Sunday dress, and they were going out to do the annual cleaning of the irrigation canal ritual. This is the exact same thing, but 100 years ago. The photo was taken by a German ethnographer by the name of Enrique Bruning. It's on the north coast, and these men were standing around. Notice the guys with their hats and tie there. These people were doing that annual cleaning of the irrigation canal celebration. Here's our Inca guy. He's either planting potatoes or harvesting potatoes. The Inca is the guy here in the center with his distinctive headdress. There's some women here on the left-hand side. They're either helping with planting or harvesting. And there's a woman there on the right-hand side with a cup in her hand, which is containing corn beer. As part of the ritual, they would be drinking and getting drunk, just like happens in those dance videos that I've been showing you. So maybe there's some sort of ritual going on at Machu Picchu. A friend of mine, the late Dan Gade, wrote a book a few years ago called Nature and Culture in the Andes. In that book, he has an interesting chapter in which he's talking about the Inca growing of coca. Coca is a plant that's native to this area. It provides a number of different things. There's the plant itself. And the coca leaves are harvested and are still widely available in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia. People chew this. It does contain a series of alkaloids, among others what we get cocaine from, but it does things like reduce hunger pangs, gives a little bit of energy, it ameliorates the effects of high altitude. In fact, if you go to Cusco, you probably drank some coca tea. It's still very commonly used in the highlands. It's not addictive. It's not cocaine. It's just a bunch of different alkaloids. People who have used it all their life move down to Lima on the coast, low elevation. They stop drinking, using coca right away. There is in the area where coca grows, and it grows best at an elevation of about 3,000, 4,000 feet on the east side of the Andes. There is a disease called uta. It's transmitted by a sandfly, and it's found around the world in various different places. There are different versions of it, different species of the sandfly. But if you get bitten by that sandfly, you might get something that looks kind of like leprosy or cancer, and it can be very disfiguring. It can ultimately be fatal. Today, with antibiotics, most of the variations are relatively easy to cure. Our soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan have had problems with leishmaniasis. But my hypothesis is that Machu Picchu was a royal estate. We know, in fact, that one of the Inca kings by the name of Pachacutec was the guy who set up Machu Picchu and had it built. It wasn't even finished when it was abandoned. There were still some quarries being used. He could go there, he could relax and enjoy life, and he could participate in the coca growing rituals. They could grow coca on those terraces. But the sandfly does not exist above about 5,000 or 6,000 foot elevation. So Machu Picchu at 7,000 feet, there is no risk. So if you've got the high status guy, the king, you don't want to get him having that disease. So Machu Picchu would be a place where he could do the coca rituals, but not have the risk of the disease. So my theory is that this place was to have the rituals, have the king participate without the risk. And it certainly was not the lost city of the Incas. I always like to tell you when my next talk is, and it's coming up in about a month. I'll be on the Oceana Sirena, and I'll be doing exactly the opposite. So my first lecture will be the same one from yesterday, the Spanish Main. My second one will be the Panama Canal one before we go through the Panama Canal. We're going Miami to Los Angeles, the reverse of this. Michael up there in the booth, I wave at him. He's done a wonderful job of helping me, setting up the sound and doing things. We haven't had too many problems here, so really thank Michael. If you've enjoyed my lectures, I hope you tell Regent. The only way that I get to come back is that people say they were halfway decent, and have a good, safe trip home. Thanks a lot.